want to welcome you to an evening with Dr. Ravi Ravindra to explore how consideration of our own mortality can open up the doors to more intentional living. And I want to invite you so Ravi chose to sit down here, so if you can't see well, you are free to move to a different seat so that you can see as well as you'd like to. I want to talk a wee bit about the Palliative Care Institute before we begin, to let you know what our work is in the community and to thank you for being here as part of supporting our work. So, the Palliative Care Institute at Western Washington University is a partnership with many other community agencies and community volunteers to transform palliative care in our community, so that we can support the human responses to living and dying, so that people who are living with serious illness or facing end of life don't have to don't have to be cured to heal. We build on collaborations among those both inside and outside of the medical industry, and work a lot with community agencies and community volunteers. So I know many of you in this room are probably very familiar with what palliative care is and the ways in which palliative care is both the same and different than hospice. But just for those of you to whom this might be a new concept, I want to explain a little bit about palliative care. So palliative care, most hospice care is palliative care, but not all palliative care is hospice. So palliative care is a much larger envelope of the kinds of care that we receive when what we live with cannot be cured. So many of us live with chronic conditions, and if you live with chronic conditions, you probably are receiving palliative care. It's the kind of care that supports you to live the most engaged and large life you can. And it might come in the form of some medical intervention, some kind of medication for the pain, or some kind of support to help you sleep better. But it might also come from the dance you do, or the music you sing, or the community you live in, or the people you hang out with. So palliative care is this larger concept that says we can support each other even when we are seriously ill or facing the end of our lives. The Palliative Care Institute does not provide direct care to the people formerly known as patients, but we do work side by side with community members and with providers to support them learning more skills about palliative care, because most people who are in the medical field don't get a whole lot of training in palliative care. Most of the medical education is focused on curative care. So we support them by doing conferences and workshops and bringing speakers to help us explore these things. And we also do a lot of community involvement activities to try to engage our community in having more conversations about what it means to live well into our dying. And this evening is one of those. I want to just cue you into two other events that are coming up soon from the Institute. One is this coming Monday from 3 to 5 at the Health Education Center at Peace Health Hospital. So it's that large building that's at the far end. You turn right instead of going into the emergency room. We will be engaging in a conversation about what is the community's role in palliative education, in palliative care. So what kinds of activities should we be doing together as a community? In what ways can we influence the kinds of policies that are there in our laws and our regulations that keep us from actually providing the kind of care we want? That's open to anyone who wants to come and be part of the conversation. And on November 13th at Fairhaven College, we're bringing Katrina Spade from Recompose Life. Katrina is looking at an alternative to body disposal, or disposition. She prefers the word disposition, body disposition, actually disposing of bodies. So our current legal ways to take care of our bodies once we die are traditional burial, which, as you know, involves a lot of chemicals. Cremation, which also involves a lot of BTUs, or green burial. And even green burial in a rural county like Whatcom County, maybe it's not such a big deal, but in many cities, there is very little land space left. And so even green burial is a problem for some areas. So she is exploring, in collaboration with researchers at Washington State University, ways to turn us into compost. And I am ready for it. So if you want to be engaged in that provocative conversation, come on the 13th to Fairhaven College. So cards about these events are available in the lobby. And additionally, there's a resource card with links to other sites that the Palliative Care Institute sponsors in support of our community education. There's an email sign-up list, so if you don't get our newsletter and you would like to, you can sign up and we'll make sure that you hear about other upcoming events. And finally, if you find yourself this evening wanting more time with Ravi over this weekend, there are still spaces open in the weekend retreat. And there's a flyer out on the table for you to pick up if you choose, or you can speak to either Jillian Froby or Elizabeth Kerwin, who you will meet in just a moment. So welcome to this lovely evening. I'm going to introduce Jillian Froby, who will introduce Ravi.
I have to follow Ravi's lead and sit on your level rather than being elevated up there. Thank you, Marie. And I just want to say that it's been such a grace-filled experience to collaborate with you in doing this evening. And thank you, Ravi, for your willingness to participate in this fundraiser for the Palliative Care Institute. We ask permission to be able to announce another event that isn't related to the Palliative Care Institute. There are some flyers that look like this on the table where the palliative care information is as well. We are bringing another dear friend of ours from India to Bellingham. I shouldn't say we're bringing, she's visiting us in Bellingham next Saturday evening, and we'll be doing a fundraiser at the YWCA Ballroom to support her efforts to help people. Actually, it started women and children, but now men and people who are mentally and physically challenged in India who are marginalized. And so we're delighted to welcome Sister Lucy to our community once more, just as we're delighted now to welcome you. So it's my privilege to introduce Ravi. And before I do, I just want to pause for a moment and say how important I think welcoming is in our community. The coupling of welcoming and gratitude always feels like it anchors us in this moment, so that for this time that we're together, we get to live as a community who has gathered together because some part of what Ravi will guide us in this evening has touched us. And those stories are very different, and yet here we are together in this moment in time. So I just want to pause for a moment really to welcome each of you and thank each of you for coming. So my partner and collaborator, Elizabeth Kerwin, gave me this assignment to introduce Ravi. And it's a little odd because over the years, Ravi has named us the Two, TWO. So I'm sitting here as one part of a duo. Ravi has been a beloved teacher and mentor for us, and he's been actually gracing our community in Bellingham with public lectures on a wide range of spiritually oriented topics, and then also guiding more intimate retreats at Turtle Haven Sanctuary, where we live in Whatcom County, since 2009. And he's been here every year since that time. It consistently surprises and delights us that he creates space in his world travels for sharing time with our community. Our direct experience of Ravi is as a voice of wisdom and a model of a teacher who is also a dedicated searcher. And that's Ravi's preferred term, searcher. To give you a taste and a synopsis of what we have been blessed to know and trust in Ravi's seeking over the years, I'd like to use his words. I feel a sense of mystery, that I don't know all there is to know, and in fact cannot know all there is to know. Mystery is openness to what may come, a willingness to be surprised, a sense of wonder. To me, a sense of wonder is real food for the spiritual body. If it is open to this, the mind can be blown over. Within this great expanse of mystery, there are also a few facts that I'd like to share with you in kind of a more formal introduction of Ravi. He's a professor emeritus at Dalhousie University in Halifax in Canada, where he served for many years as a professor in 3 departments there: comparative religion, philosophy, and physics. He's also a member of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton, a fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla, which is in India, and the founding director of the Threshold Award for Integrative Knowledge. Ravi's spiritual search has led him to the teachings of Krishnamurti, G.I. Gurdjieff, Zen, yoga, and into a deep immersion in the mystical teachings of the Indian and Christian classical traditions. He's the author of numerous books on religion, science, mysticism, and spirituality, some of which are for sale outside in the hallway. For decades, Ravi has been a voice of compassion and of hope, something that we desperately need now in our time. He's traveled the world speaking to diverse audiences about the need for a deep transformation of human consciousness. While his academic achievements are impressive, he holds many degrees, Ravi claims that what he needed for his inner life could not be found by accumulating knowledge in academia. Again, Ravi's words, quote, "We're not appreciating the Buddha or Christ because they had some nice theories about reality, but because of the kind of persons they were. I am persuaded that truth cannot be known, but it can be embodied." Ravi always gifts us with suggested readings prior to each retreat that he teaches. And one of them this time is by Brother David Steindl-Rast, in which he contrasts dying as either a mere giving in or giving up or even being killed to a more vital way of dying, which includes awareness of and practicing a daily dying while you are alive. We all look forward to your illuminations, Ravi, on this as a practice for enhancing meaning in our lives. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to sing the song first.
Oh, that's right. Yes, please.
So we decided to start with a song, and since both microphones aren't muted, we're going to use this one. And then I'll give it back to Ron. So I love the invocation of the mystery. So that's what this song is about, the mysteries. Wild birds wheel in joyous flight, flowers turning toward the light. There are mysteries we cannot know. Storm clouds carry wind and rain to push the river
faded on the shore. Twilight through an open door. There are mysteries we cannot know. Stars spin and dance in every stone, and they sing in our blood and bone. Naked we come, naked we go. Naked we come, naked we go. The dark dove with the flickering eye chases night across the sky. There are mysteries we cannot know. The owl wing lifts and opens wide. Moonlight calls out to the tide. Naked we come, naked we go. Naked we come, naked we go. Memories gathered in your hand will write our stories in the sand. There are mysteries we cannot know. A falling leaf, a season past, every breath might be your last. Naked we come, naked we go. Naked we come, naked we go.
For us to take a few moments just to find a little. I'm being told to speak a little bit more loudly already, okay. Just take a moment to be aware of the fact that we live in a very large universe. Because it is useful for us to find our place in the universe. We are now told by our astrophysicists that there are 2 trillion galaxies. And we live in a very average galaxy. Even there, we are not at the center of that galaxy. We are just hovering around a very peripheral star. And the universe has been around, at least the universe as we know it, has been around, according to our scientists, for many, many billion years, when you and I, as we call ourselves, did not exist. And it will continue for billions of years after we stop existing as we now are. This is only the quantitative side, but what all the sages, without exception, in human history have said, and in fact all the great scientists and philosophers also, naturally in different languages, different ways of expression, but they have all said that the entire space is filled with conscious and subtle energies. Naturally, the labels vary. For example, it may be said that it is filled with God or the Absolute or Allah or the Holy Spirit or Brahma. Many other labels get attached to this. So just for convenience, given what I assume to be the general background of the people here from the Judeo-Christian tradition, so just to make sentences, I may therefore use more familiar terminology. So we might therefore say that the entire space is filled with the Holy Spirit. What is common not only to the Holy Spirit, but all these other designations, is that these energies are subtle and more conscious than we are. Therefore, we cannot command them. What is required from our side is attitude of invitation, welcoming, receptivity. And the suggestion by all of these great teachers is that there is something required from our side to become more and more receptive. Initially, I will come back to this point a little later to develop a bit more, but now, just as we are sitting here, one of the fundamental contributions we can make from our side for receptivity is relaxation. Even in a very ordinary way, we would say, in standard physics, that subtler the energy, more easily it is repelled by tensions. So, physical relaxation is easier to speak about, but what is in fact much more important is an emotional relaxation. Freedom from anxiety, worry, expectation, certainly any large tensions such as resentment or jealousy or anger. But it's not so easy for us to be free of these tensions because the whole world is actually driven by these very emotional tensions. But we can move towards a little bit of a freedom if the usual emotional energy that is being taken up by anxiety and worry is like a constant dripping tap. If that energy can be intentionally used for some slightly subtler feeling, for example, the very fact that in this vast universe I should be created for a few decades. This is absolutely miraculous. If I can, first of all, have a sense of gratitude for this, that here I am, that I can even raise this kind of question, why should I be here? If these energies and forces are really conscious, how could they be that dumb to create me for a few decades? Keep this in mind. If I can a little bit have a sense of gratitude and even more importantly, really a sense of wonder about this. Not that I can figure it out. I can assure you These kinds of mysteries, sometimes they get called spiritual mysteries. Even in principle, they cannot be solved. Quite differently from scientific mysteries. I myself, many decades ago, was supervisor for some PhD students in physics. It would have been irresponsible of me to encourage these students to take on a project or a problem that cannot be solved. It does occasionally actually happen that a problem is wrongly framed or that we don't have sufficient technological development to in fact be able to verify anything that is a consequence of this particular solution. So that kind of thing can happen. But in general, at least in principle, the problems that are undertaken, to be sure, they all arise from a sense of mystery, but they can actually be solved. And furthermore, there is another very important feature of this. If Einstein solved a problem, he can publish it, then I don't need to waste my time on it. This is not true for any spiritual mysteries. Spiritual mysteries, even in principle, cannot be solved, or even if we said, let us say, that the Buddha solved something and he even published them in his Four Noble Truths. Does that mean that we don't need to waste our time on it now? In fact, every graduate student is always concerned, in physics at least, that the next issue of the Physical Reviews will precisely publish what he's working on for the last 3 years. And then he'll have to start all over again. Why? Because the requirement in solving physical mysteries is that it has to be something new. Otherwise, you don't get the PhD. I can assure you, all our great sages can keep coming back to exactly the same realization, and nobody is going to fail them. So, scientific mysteries are very different from spiritual mysteries. Spiritual mysteries, on the other hand, if one can stay with them, contemplating them, sometimes they are dissolved for the person involved. Then there is not a denial of these mysteries, certainly not a fear of these mysteries. In general, there is a celebration. Bach would write music, Newton would do physics. Uday Shankar will dance, Nagarjuna will do philosophy. Everybody does what they are good at as a celebration of the mystery, constantly convinced that the mystery cannot be solved. Therefore, coming back to the mystery, staying there with more and more with a sense of wonder, not with the expectation that I'll figure it out and I can then publish it, then my friends don't have to waste their time on it. That sense of wonder, I make a suggestion to you, you can try it. Don't just simply believe anything I say, because really this is in fact the biggest difficulty mostly created by religions. They want believers, not searchers. So, temporarily you may believe something just to see whether it is true in your own experience. To be truly bringing the scientific spirit to this, all great spiritual teachers have a very thoroughgoing scientific spirit. They don't simply buy something, just even if a combination of Newton and Einstein said something, that doesn't make it true. Temporarily, we won't dismiss it easily. These guys, you have to take them seriously if you're a physicist. But still, that because they say so doesn't make it true. It still has to be verified. So, one of the things that I would very much suggest to you, that wonder and anxiety cannot coexist. Now, as I said, don't simply buy it, but you can try it on your own. We don't have much time right now here to try it, but you can try it here if you like. If you approach anything with a sense of wonder, you cannot at that time be anxious. And that leads to an emotional relaxation, which is the requirement for receptivity of subtle vibrations or energies. The other thing that I would recommend is to actually search for right alignment. Again, we tend to think of this only as a physical affair. It also has a physical correspondence. As far as our biologists know, the only creatures who can have a vertical posture, and if their eyes are open, they can look horizontally, is only Homo sapiens have that possibility. No other creatures. And if, in fact, the universe is pervaded by conscious energies, everything then, especially special requirements, possibly correspond to what is specially called for from human beings. Now again, nobody needs to buy any of this, but from my own perspective, this would actually resonate in most of you, corresponding to the two great commandments in the whole Bible. Connection with the vertical deities, divinity, and connection with our fellow human beings. So, to search for that posture, but that's only the physical side. We have intellectual postures. And there, a very simple reminder, even if I had the combined intelligence of Einstein and Aristotle and Shankara and Nagarjuna, I still cannot know all there is to know. So to remain in a state of unknowing, which is not a state of ignorance. We have a very classical example of this. Let me quickly just mention this to you. Most of you perhaps already know this. This can be found in the last dialogue written by Plato. The dialogue is called Phaedo. He's describing Socrates, who has been condemned to drink hemlock and he's going to die. And you probably all know why he has been condemned to, because he was trying to be independent-minded and society doesn't like that kind of thing. So he has to be removed. And so, quite understandably, some of his pupils are very sad and some of them are crying. So Socrates says to them, you're behaving as if you know what happens after death. Furthermore, as if you know that what happens after death is worse than what happens before death. And then, in my judgment, really one of the most classical phrases in the whole of philosophy, Socrates said, as for myself, since I do not know, therefore I am free. answers kill inquiry. Nobody is recommending ignorance. But if I get so occupied with my knowledge that I begin to claim I know everything, even if I don't say those words, because that would seem obviously silly even to one who claims to know everything. But it's more a question of an attitude. Can I remain in a learning mind? Not closed with knowledge. There is another, that dialogue actually continues. Let me take a moment to say this here, because even when his disciples are more or less calmed down, then they ask Socrates, where should we bury you? And this is very much related with our inquiry this evening here. Socrates says to them, well, you can bury me wherever you like if you can find me. See, there is such a conviction as if Socrates is his body. Am I my body? Among many things are common in all religious traditions, but one particular aspect that I would just like to mention here, as far as I know, every religious tradition actually somehow manages to convey that the death of the body is not the death of the person. Clearly, the implication is that the person is not the body. So we need to raise this as a question for us, because I remember I was particularly struck by this many, many decades ago. I was in Thailand in a Buddhist monastery. In Thailand, by the way, it's a rather unique situation that one can be a monk, even for a week. I recommend to some of you to try this. So I was a monk, a Buddhist monk, for a week in Thailand. And the very first, practically the very first moment really, other fellow monks saying, brother, remember death. This is very common. It used to be so in Christian monasteries also earlier. Gradually it seems to have slightly faded away there. But in Buddhist monasteries it's still very much alive. Whenever one monk meets another, this is what they remind them. Brother, remember death. I was much younger at that time, and for me, it was immediately really raised this question very much. What is it that dies? And here, I first of all invite you, actually even in your meditations at home, it's a useful thing to become aware of your breathing. Because in all spiritual teachings, very much emphasis that the particle of divinity, various other labels get attached to it, like spirit or soul, enters into us through our breath. Maybe it'll be useful for me just to quote to you. This is from the book of Genesis. God created human beings from the earth, then he breathed his own breath into them to make them alive. What does it mean? It's easy to dismiss these things or to simply repeat them, but if we slightly take a few moments to ponder over it, as long as I'm breathing, it's the breath of God in me. We have this linguistic habit, and I actually invite you to seriously, don't simply believe this, but to seriously question this. Do I breathe or am I being breathed? Simply remember, I did not create myself. Nor did I create the apparatus that breathes, nor the air that it needs to breathe in order to be alive. This apparatus is not created by me. Why should I be saying I am breathing? Come back to this remark from the book of Genesis that I just mentioned. I know later on teachings, particularly it helps the churches to keep control over people, to say you're so sinful, you have to be saved, etc. But that's not what the book of Genesis is saying. It's God's breath in you. Similarly, just to mention quickly from another tradition, from Rig Veda, which is the most ancient text in any Indo-European language and is regarded the source of the Hindu tradition, we are all called Amritasya Putra, which is to say children of eternal life, that every human being is that. And very strong idea in all teachings that different levels of reality are all wishing to evolve in order, as it were, to come home, to come back to God, if you like. Evolution there is meant to mean evolution of consciousness. The idea being that God, Holy Spirit, Brahma, Allah, whatever phrase appeals to you, has the highest level of consciousness. It's useful to keep this in mind. Let me take just a sort of a footnote here. This is a major contrast between the underlying assumptions of modern science, by which we mean 16th century onward science, and all spiritual teachings. According to modern science, primary reality is matter without any consciousness. According to all the spiritual teachings, primary reality is the highest level of consciousness. So there are fundamental differences here. Again, just another little footnote. More and more now, a lot of data has been gathered that even in many instances, even when the brain is completely dead, still, in many cases, still seems to be some consciousness. A person comes alive after 1 hour, 2 days, sometimes even longer. So this is creating a whole different kind of questioning of these fundamental assumptions. In fact, hardly a week ago, a whole new commission has been launched called the Galileo Commission, I'm actually a member of that group, which has just launched it, about 60 of us, really saying that the fundamental assumptions of science need to be questioned, and a whole extended science is required. Not to be against the contemporary science, but it seems to have its limitations, especially to do with the whole area of consciousness. But that is by way of simply pointing out that this general suggestion from all the spiritual teachings is that different levels of consciousness are all eager to evolve, to come home, to return to God. And therefore, one level of consciousness, which we may now call a particle of divinity, if you like, we can call it a soul or an aspect of the spirit, it needs therefore to undertake some action in order to evolve. Therefore, it needs a body. So it's the soul that takes on a body. It's not that the body takes on a soul. We need to be very clear about this. Soul takes on a body, and I'm using the word soul. Not every teaching uses these words. Keep this in mind. Don't get stuck on one phrase or the other. Expression of truth is not the truth. It's a very strong tendency. Therefore, it is sometimes very helpful if great truths are expressed in more than one way. This, in my judgment, is really the major value of comparative religious studies. That major truths there you can find expressed in more than one way that can give the freedom from assuming or accepting expression of truth to be the truth. So, whatever phrase appeals to you, but the idea is that in order to evolve, this element of spirit needs to undertake an action. We have a very classical text. It's a sister philosophy of yoga philosophy called Sankhya. The main person there is a character called Ishwar Krishna. This is what he said: spirit without the body is lame, body without the spirit is blind. So in order to undertake an action, the spirit needs the body. By the way, this word body here, just a quick footnote here, is not meant to exclude what we ordinarily call mind. For example, when it is said that the Word became flesh, there is no suggestion that it became just a hunk of meat. That would be quite absurd. So it acquires the whole personhood, living being. So, same thing. So I'm using the word body just for simplicity, but keep calling it body-mind, if you like, just to be more accurate. So the soul or the spirit needs the body as an instrument. Whereas all our social training, education, etc., whenever we think of me or any concern or fear about me dying, what is it that dies? Body will die. But as I earlier also said, every religion insists that the death of the body is not the death of the person. We can keep quoting it, but until we actually try to understand, how do I then proceed from here? Now here, if there is one lesson which is common to all scriptures and teachings of all the sages, I will just mention that, but meanwhile I also want to invite you, if you know any exception to this, please help me find out. And that lesson is simply this: as long as I remain the way I am, I cannot come to the truth or God or the real or the absolute, whatever label you wish to use. Let me simply repeat this in slightly different words. A very radical transformation of the whole of my being is said to be necessary before I can come to any kind of truth. This is the one single common lesson of all teachers, all scriptures. And as I said, if you know any exception to this, I'll be happy to learn. Let me therefore just give one or two more or less supporting references here. This is from the Gospel of Matthew. Christ remarked, "Unless you leave yourself behind, you cannot be a follower of mine." Same idea is actually expressed much more strongly, sometimes sounds almost too strong. Unless you die to the world, you cannot come to me. Or maybe some of you would know, Nicodemus comes to meet Christ. He's a member of the Jewish council. Some of them are uneasy about Christ, but he's not. So he comes in the middle of the night. The very first question he asks is, "How may I enter the kingdom of heaven?" What is the response? Unless you're born again. People often stop there, but let me complete the sentence here. Unless you're born again, born from above, born of the Spirit, you cannot come to the kingdom. So it's such a radical transformation that it is like a new birth. Because in general, we are being driven by our bodily needs and desires, and the mind, ordinary mind, just basically justifies this in one way or the other. And the whole thing is being driven by reward or punishment, fear and desire, wish for approval and fear of disapproval. Even disapproval of God, whatever we imagine God to be. This is another place where religions do more harm than they do good, by the way. Jump to God is like jumping to Mount Everest. I simply remind you, how many prophets do you know in the whole Abrahamic tradition, from Abraham to Prophet Muhammad, who were met by God? They are met by one angel or an archangel. God is too high. There are 9 orders of angels before you come to God. God even said to Moses, "If you see me, you will not stay alive." But religions just jump to the Mount Everest without assisting to climb little hills to practice something. So, no need to jump to the highest level, but how does this instrument actually serve the very entity that has taken on this instrument for its purposes, not for the purpose of the body, including the mind, by the way, I have to keep reminding you this, that the body-mind is the instrument, and therefore this idea is expressed in varieties of ways, that the whole purpose of human existence is to do the divine will. Now, naturally, this is not so easy, because first of all, I need to try to be more and more aware, why have I been created? fundamental question to which we need to keep returning again and again is, why am I here? And what am I? Am I actually just the body? Even though religions keep saying other things, but what is my experience of that? And this is where the whole question that I began with, that the spiritual mysteries cannot really be figured out, cannot be solved in that sense. But if one can remain and cultivate the practice of a little quietening of the usual mind that is just like a barking dog and carries on, then one can sometimes hear whispers of a subtler level, from a subtler level of reality. Every teaching or any great teacher, you can think of any that has appealed to you, will sooner or later you will find them saying one place or the other that feeling or heart is almost the entry into a higher mind. That the heart is touched by something much before the mind can be clear about it. Let me just quote to you a remark of Pascal, hardly a dismissible scientist. I'm sure most of you know his name. We measure pressure by so many Pascal. This is what he said: heart has reasons that reason does not know. So don't dismiss the kind of subtle feeling that sometimes come more or less as whispers. And then gradually to begin to hear, what am I? Why am I here? Always keeping it in mind that whatever I usually call myself is obviously almost designed for destruction. It's going to be here for a few decades. Which is also the reason, by the way, why, for example, Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita actually defining yoga, essentially one of the definitions of yoga is a yogi sees that I do nothing at all. That an instrument isn't doing something. A yogi becomes the instrument. The initiative is all, just to use that very terminology from the Bhagavad Gita, is by Krishna or by God. But the body and the mind has become an instrument. Maybe I give you an example from the Abrahamic tradition, which is actually a very much more clearer example, as a matter of fact, John's Gospel. These are the remarks of Christ. I do nothing on my own. I'm not the author of the words I use. I say what my Father in heaven tells me to say. He's not even the author of the words. This is a real instrument of the divine will. So the reason why the spirit or soul or a particle of divinity or the breath of God has taken on this body is so that it can be an instrument to assist the evolution of this particle to come to a higher level of consciousness. Now, therefore, what is required from our side is to gradually to try to hear. As I said initially, it's always in terms of whispers. Teachings, traditions can assist pointing to something, but everything you read by any scripture or any teaching, always ask, how does it apply to me? How do I actually understand this, verify this? Otherwise, we can just believe whatever we like, but our mind is not, neither the mind nor the heart is really satisfied, and just merely fear comes. So we have this, since this is actually William Butler Yeats has this a poem in which he says, neither dread nor hope attend a dying animal, but a man awaits his death, dreading and hoping all. But dread and hope, that is the source of the whole of our ego is driven by this. Earlier I said reward and punishment, that's another way of putting it. And religions can use precisely that to take advantage of this. So you're going to go to hell, or you're going to go to heaven if you do X, Y, Z. So dread and hope. That is precisely the thing that one needs to be free of. But until I can begin to at least acknowledge, even theoretically, that I did not create myself, that I'm not running the whole universe, these are obvious facts. In fact, I would actually suggest this as a little exercise to you. In your own life, you're not running your own life, let me assure you. Take 3 or 4, if you like, most significant events in your life that you would say changed your life. Nobody else needs to decide it. For most of us, the person you end up marrying is one of those events. But even that only, I give that as merely an example. For me, for example, coming to Canada was one of those events. Or meeting Krishnamurti was one of those events. Or meeting Madame de Salzman was one of those events. But whatever event you would say changed your life, take 3 or 4 of them and impartially write down, starting 1 year ahead, what was your contribution to bring that about? If you're not surprised, I often say to my friends, if you're not surprised, I'll give you a ticket to come to Halifax to visit me. We just imagine, we fantasize that we are running our life. There are so many forces that are at play. I didn't create, keep coming back to this single sentence, I did not create myself. I know it sounds very simple, but if I can actually ponder this, stay with this, there cannot be any fear of death. Fear of death arises from the vague impression as if I have somehow barged into this cosmological party. And they will find me out and kick me out. I am here, whatever I now understand by I, body, mind, is here, not by my making, but corresponding to these subtle conscious energies, call it Holy Spirit, God, whatever. And then the real question is, when this instrument is no longer functioning, so they need another instrument. So, if we can be clear about these absolutely 2 or 3 simple statements which nobody can disagree with, namely, I did not create myself. The universe is very large. It existed for billions of years without whatever I call myself, and it will happily keep existing. That my being here whatever these forces have brought me, whichever forces or energies of Holy Spirit, if you like, could hardly be against me. Unless they're really dumb. They need an instrument. And if the instrument is not functioning properly, then they would move on. So it's not that they are against the instrument or that the instrument is running itself. A yogi sees that I do nothing at all. So in the process of wishing to be more and more free of the self that I need to leave behind, as Christ's quotation that I mentioned earlier, what keeps us more connected with our present me is actually suffering more than anything else. This seems very perverse, but it is actually, I think, true. Don't take my word for it. You can try in your own life. If somebody admires me, it occasionally happens after my talk, then for it's very nice, but half an hour later I have no idea who this person was or what he said. But if somebody insults me, I remember it for a longer time. We are more attached to suffering than to anything else. The whole field or the whole profession of psychotherapy exists because of that. Now, so much so that Krishna, again, one of the definitions of yoga that he gives is yoga is breaking the bond with suffering. Because we are very much bonded to suffering. Now, there the question really then arises, how do I become free of this? At the root of really all teachings, and maybe I'll just give examples from the Judeo-Christian teaching here. Sacrifice is regarded as a cosmological necessity for maintaining order. God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son. For what? Hardly a bowl of cherries. For a sacrifice. So whenever any suffering is intentionally undertaken, then it becomes a sacrifice. Very simple example, I could be deprived of food, I could be starved, or I could undertake a fast. What's the difference? Intention. This is a large area. Let me just quickly mention here, because I also wrote down the question that Mary had raised that I would like to, that's my writtens down here. I'll speak to them. And I would be very happy to exchange with other people also. But it's important to try to understand that whatever we understand anything spiritual, which by definition is something subtler than the body and the mind, all mental shenanigans are not going to reveal this. And it requires a fundamental requirement of attention and intention. Because the suggestion is that in the spiritual realm, when we speak about evolution of anybody coming closer to God or closer to higher angels, it's the level of consciousness which manifests in us essentially as compassion, attention, intention. So to cultivate these characteristics is a way to assist the development. I'm going to read the question that Mary had written, but please feel absolutely free after I finish this here to raise your own question or comments. You don't need to be necessarily agreeing with anything I'm saying here. We are all moving toward death from the moment of our birth, yet in our culture we have turned our face away from death. What does daily dying mean? Daily dying is really more like daily refreshing. Again, just to remind you, this is actually even a comment of St. Paul, first letter to the Corinthians. I die daily. It is question of, can I be free of what I understood yesterday? Can I still be learning? Or can I also be free of all the things that I get so attached to that I would be feeling really deprived if something is lost or, So it's a very strong suggestion, really, in fact, from many teachings, a great saying, it's a very old Sufi saying, also actually on the St. Paul's Monastery on Mount Athos. If you die before you die, you do not die when you die. Clearly, dying is not harakiri. That's not what one is speaking about in the first remark here. If you die before you die, it is more a question of becoming a little freer of this is the way it is, this is what I know, this is exactly. So if I can be in that sense a little free of that attachment or that fixation, that is leaving myself behind. That's, if you like, dying to the world, dying to my own possessions or my acquisitions or my knowledge. So daily dying is really more like daily refreshing, as far as I see it. Then you have, in our mainstream American culture, death is viewed as a failure, death as the enemy. It's again really the question is, if I can remember that everybody will die. So this is, in fact, the great epic in India, Mahabharata, has a question, is called the Yaksh Prashna. Prashna means question. Yaksh is a celestial spirit, and this spirit is taking charge of a lake, and if anybody wants to get any water from that lake, this celestial spirit says, unless you can answer my question rightly, you cannot take water from it, and if you try to take it, you'll be killed. So some warriors say, what the hell, they try to take water, they die. And the only person who succeeds in answering this question is a man who's said to be the son of Dharma, Yudhishthira, but not getting into the names here. The question is, what is the greatest mystery in the world? And the only acceptable answer to this celestial spirit was, even though everybody sees people all around him dying, but nobody believes that he too will die. This, according to this celestial spirit, this is called the Yaksh Prashna. And so, if I can actually realize that I did not create myself, that my being here is also a function of cosmological forces and energies, and I've been brought to this party, and I'll be taken away. There'll be other parties. there is no reason to. So, in any case, really, basically, what is behind that is the death is viewed as a failure simply because one imagines that I should continue keeping this body alive. Really, if you're really bad to your children and grandchildren, you could live more than 100 years old. But have mercy upon them. I have a friend right now actually who has to take care of very elderly parents, and I tell you it's very difficult. So be nice to your children. It's time to move on. Allow others. After all, this is what we do, for example, in any university or anywhere else. We wish the senior professors to retire. Why? So that the younger ones can have their part to play, right? Exploring the challenges of aging and dying in a culture where being young is lifted up. This is very much really connected with this previous question in a way, that there is another thing. For most people, as they grow a little older, they also become a little disenchanted with all the usual running around of the world. Then it is harder for bosses to keep them in sync. So children are easier to manage. So it's not surprising that the youth are again here. I have been actually trying to persuade many psychologists to even do some experiments on it or to gather some data. Here we have the notion of a midlife crisis. You never hear an expression like this in India or China. And I was rather interested, why not? And what is actually more implied in these other places, that just as for most people, let us say anywhere between the ages of 15 to 17, they have a puberty, which allows them to create a biological birth. That in general, usually between 40 to 55 years of age, there is a spiritual puberty, a wish for a spiritual birth, exactly the birth that Christ spoke about to Nicodemus. Unless you're born again, born from above, born of the Spirit. The suggestion is that each one of us has a fleshly birth, obviously. So even Christ refers to this, his Father in heaven. That's a different Father from earthly Father. It's not denying the earthly Father. But the suggestion is very strong, at least in the Indian tradition, that there is a time period when one is more or less taken care of one's existence in the world, has family, etc., or education earlier, then it's time for a spiritual birth. So the so-called midlife crisis is actually that. But if we were to say puberty is wrong, even the ordinary puberty is wrong, and we could try to interfere with that and try to cure people of that, we could probably manage to do that for a little while. It's the same thing about the so-called midlife crisis. In general, people feel, okay, I've been having a job, I've done okay. What is my life about? Those are precisely the questions that need to arise. So the so-called midlife crisis is actually a wish for a spiritual birth. But I'm not surprised that the younger people naturally don't feel that kind of an urge there. But I would also suggest that one thing that in practice can very much help, and maybe you are already actually arranging that, I think periodic gathering of older people seriously interested in trying to understand what is life, what is death. Is it really true that it's the breath of God in me which is keeping me alive? Not simply to repeat these words or to accept them, but to actually raise this kind of inquiry, and whenever there is a periodic gathering of a community of fellow searchers, it's the greatest help, much greater than having an illumined teacher. An increasing number of Americans do not have a strong spiritual or religious faith. What does living into dying look like in a culture that doesn't have a spiritual center? I'm actually not so sure that I necessarily agree with you that the Americans don't have a spiritual center. I think the religions have done great harm to spiritual centers. These figures I'm about to say are 3 years old, because at that time I was invited to give a talk on the yoga of business and business of yoga. So in that connection I collected some of these figures. So these are 3 years old figures. In the USA, 15% Americans were practicing yoga. This is not a small number. And the average family income was more than $100,000. So we are talking about reasonably well-placed American, which will have a lot of influence in the culture. My impression is that the numbers may have now increased. These are 3-year-old numbers. And the business at that time was worth $15 billion. Now, much of that is, again, even any spiritual practice gets used for business purposes or to increasing sex appeal. That's what yoga seems to be doing. But occasional yoga practitioner does begin to wonder. After all, yoga is, just like any serious spiritual teaching, is a science of transformation. Because that's the fundamental requirement, that unless you're radically transformed, there is no way you can come to truth. So any serious teaching is always trying to find ways of advising, assisting, demonstrating means of transformation. So yoga is a science of transformation, and occasionally yoga practitioner actually begins to get a little feeling for that. So I'm not really convinced that the Americans are any less spiritually oriented. Spiritual orientation is not a matter of a decision. It's the spirit that has created me. So to say that we don't have a spiritual center is really just a cultural remark to make. But I cannot actually exist if it was not the breath of God keeping me alive. So therefore I don't think Americans are in any worse shape than anybody else, but it is a worldwide situation. We are all driven by what can I achieve, how do I have more power, etc. So maybe I should really allow other people to raise their questions here. So I just wanted to take some of your questions. Please. You don't have to necessarily have questions. You may wish to make a comment or disagree with anything I'm saying. Are you raising a hand in the back there? Yeah, please speak up since you don't have a microphone, so maybe you'll have to speak more loudly.
I think I can be loud. First of all, a gratitude, and because of an excitement that I'm feeling. I just last weekend was at a retreat when this wonderful person was talking. He's not a scientist. He's just a wisdom man, I feel. But he was freeing me as he talked about a spirituality of incompleteness. And I just felt that some of your opening, what you were saying at the beginning, made some of what he was offering go deeper in me. And there was this sense of, everything belongs. So gratitude for what you were offering. Now, it's okay that this is going to sound very egocentric, because it probably is. I struggle a little bit with the idea that the language, the term that God needs an instrument. Genesis talks about how let us create, let us, as you know, let us create in our image. I can't image God as an instrument. So that's a wondering, kind of just put a hold that in a way, and it really isn't a question, it's just a wondering.
Actually,
So if I could repeat what I heard and see if we got it right. So the wondering is about the use of the language instrument to describe spirit, that you're uncomfortable with that language and would like some reflection on that puzzle.
Yeah, maybe not uncomfortable as so much as just, again, just a wondering. There's a newness to it. And I'm okay with that. It's just, it truly is a wondering. And then the other wondering is that the greatest mystery, for me is unconditional love. I find that just...
What will you say, great mystery?
The greatest mystery is unconditional love. That's...
Yes.
Okay. So
that just talks of all mysteries to me. That love loves.
Yes, first of all, in a way, one could really not be... It's a good idea not to be very definite about why God created the universe. And then there are also different levels of consciousness. We can see that. There is a remark actually in the Quran which is a little bit maybe, if one can find it helpful. Allah wished to be known, therefore he created man. Now, why would he wish to be known? One could keep questioning this, right? But the implication, at least as I see it, that it is a call to human beings to try to know God. But the fact certainly that in the universe we can see different levels of consciousness being manifested. Then the question of the instrument was really arising that each of these levels is, as it were, wishing to evolve. And in order to evolve, they need to undertake some action. So the word instrument doesn't have to be understood as something low level. If you can say, how does one undertake some action? This is why I quoted earlier, spirit without the body is lame. So, therefore the body is required for this level of consciousness to rise. So if the word instrument doesn't appeal to you or it gives you a slightly negative impression, we don't need to get stuck on this. It's the means through which the spirit can rise to a higher level. Okay? Yeah.
Ravi, you mentioned at one point, could you stand in there? There was the conversation about the breath and the spirit longing to go home to God, as it were, through the levels. Could you say more about that or say it again? I want to retain it. I don't know that I captured what my question was.
No, the general suggestion is that everything begins from the highest level of consciousness, then it is being manifested in the universe, different levels of consciousness. For example, we can even look at, in the biblical tradition, you have 9 orders of angels between God and human beings. And then below human beings, we have animals or inanimate material, etc. So that's what I mean by levels. Corresponding to each level, there is a certain consciousness. And the suggestion is that each of these wishes to evolve the way it sometimes gets expressed. That's actually expression of St. Augustine, that they're all trying to come home. That's a way of saying to return to God, if you like. So in order to evolve, some action is required. Very strong suggestion, this is actually very much from Plato, that our soul can sink completely into matter, or it can rise to the one. He refers to it as the one, I think. So, whatever we mean by spiritual discipline or practice, it is really to assist the development of the soul. Yes.
Sort of continuing on that.
Would you stand?
Sure. Continuing on that that vein of thought, would you? I tend to wonder this sometimes. Would you assume that in God creating man, He was trying to evolve?
God Himself?
Yeah.
This is where actually it's an interesting question to raise, but this is where we need to be a little careful about the language, because almost always, especially in the Abrahamic tradition, the word God is used for the highest level of consciousness, but not always. For example, just to give you a different example, Meister Eckhart actually makes a distinction between Deus and Deitas, God and Godhead. For him, Godhead is subtler or higher than God. So, but therefore it depends on how we are going to use the word here. If you use it to mean the highest level already, then it doesn't make sense to speak about its evolving. If on the other hand we could use that the whole, everything is evolving, so maybe even whatever we mean by God is also evolving. But let me just take another slightly, but it's related. Even the greatest sages, the Buddha Buddha or Christ or Krishna are unable to really describe the ultimate reality. And on the other hand, our mind is always very eager to latch on to something. And then it is also, there are many experiments like this, that whatever I really am gung-ho on, sooner or later my mind will end up projecting this. So much so that this man that I just mentioned earlier, Meister Eckhart, has this very interesting comment. If there were a God of whom I had any idea, it will not be worth having him as God. This is Meister Eckhart. Because the whole practice actually is to be free of my mind. And if my mind, of course it has all kinds of ideas about God, about everything else. And it's going to keep projecting this. And we have, some of you may know this, even in recent, lots of data is now gathered about so-called near-death experiences. If one comes from a Buddhist background, even as it were after the body is supposedly dead, one is experiencing Buddhist figures. If you come from a Christian background, one is experiencing Christian figures. Now, so you see how large that conditioning is. Therefore, this remark of Meister Eckhart need not be dismissed, but he is pointing to something. So we need to be very careful. We need the language, but language itself creates all kinds of difficulties. Yes, ma'am. Yes, sir. Please stand up and.
Yes, I do appreciate what you said about none of the sages adequately describing what this the afterlife is, wherever place we go to after death. I mean, so many parables. Christ said, "This is the heaven, the kingdom of heaven is like this, or such is like in the kingdom of heaven." It's always drawing a comparison to it versus saying exactly what it is. The same thing in the creation story, I think, my own personal belief, is that how are you going to explain to a bunch of tent people about atoms and splitting compounds and molecules and all these things that had to happen for you to be you? Well, tell them a parable. Tell them a story about something that they can relate to in their finite minds. In my own life, I kind of view myself as a tool, as a resource, as an instrument, whatever you want to call it. I don't care. That I am doing the will of He who sent me, I suppose. And the Apostle Paul had said that from before the foundations of the world, that you were made to walk in greatness, and that you were made to do things, for the glory of God. And so this, that's how I view myself, as merely as a tool, as an instrument, as a body, just doing the will of Him who sent me. But I do appreciate the fact that you say that you can't even conceive what's on the other side, and that wanting to know, that always wanting to know, is what fuels growth, fuels evolution of our spirit.
I think, as I said earlier also, that our heart actually sometimes hears something, or at least the whispers, and then one wishes to correspond to that, which is perfectly fine, even if we may not be knowing in the sense that you can clearly describe this, etc. Because really, practically all of these great teachers end up saying that it's a little bit like trying to describe colors to a blind man. This is a very commonly used expression, actually. So they may say, well, if it feels a little hot, it's red. Or if it feels a little cool, it's green, or something like this. So in a way, I'm sure we would all ourselves even agree, sometimes you have an experience of something and you're trying to describe it to somebody else. It's not so easy to describe it. Anybody else wishes to make a comment? Yeah.
I don't know exactly how to frame this, but I'm wondering how difficult or ugly or wicked people fit into all of this, and how are we to deal with that? How is our spiritual growth enhanced by their presence? Or then I'm not sure how to say this, but I think maybe you get my idea.
Well, certainly can assist the growth of compassion. What is very interesting, whenever, again, having people, even the very great sages would say that the ultimate can't be described, but still they say something about it. So among the usual sorts of expressions that are associated with, if you like, with God or with the highest level of reality, are that it is truth. For example, some of you would know these are standard Sanskrit words, Sat, Chit, Anand. Truth, consciousness, and delight or bliss. Difficult to translate the word Anand by one single word in English. But also that it is love, compassion, mercy. For example, it's almost impossible actually in the Islamic tradition, especially in the Sufi tradition, to ever reference to Allah without saying Allah the merciful or Buddha the compassionate. There are always expressions like this. So, and then of course a higher level of consciousness, which would mean awareness, attention. So these are the, if you like, the characteristics. So then when you say there are people who are very wicked, well, they could assist enhancing our compassion, maybe. I don't know. Really, in a way, I have to be very careful because I'm quite certain that at least I know one or two people who would be convinced if they needed to give an example of somebody very wicked, they will point to me. So who we regard as wicked is a very personal matter. Somebody may be wishing to find, let us say, sufficient food for his children and is unable to get it, so he goes and maybe steals something. So we would call it very wicked. But he's perhaps doing something that needs to be done for saving his children. We don't know all this. But I'm sure there are people of all kinds who... There is actually a remark of the Buddha which is relevant here. There has never been a person who was liked by everyone. And similarly, there never has been a person who was disliked by everyone. This is what the Buddha said. So what you're calling as very wicked people, I imagine they also have their moments of love, care. So one needs to be a little careful about this.
Can I add to that? I'm thinking of people of power, in particular, past, present, and they too have the breath of God in them.
Yes, they too have a breath of God in them, but if they're not paying attention to that, I mean, what do we mean by any kind of a spiritual practice? first of all, not to deny that every person who exists has a breath of God. But then, what would be the meaning of spiritual practice? Namely, to begin to try to understand what is required of me to actually become an instrument of the divine will. So if I don't try to even bother about this, it's just my will, then that doesn't mean that they don't have the breath of God in them, but they are not recognizing it, they're not willing to serve it. That's another, by the way, that's another phrase that would be commonly used by people in spiritual traditions. They wish to serve. Varieties of ways, serving humanity, serving the whole nature, varieties of ways it comes out. So, I don't think you and I will disagree that there are people. It's a good idea for us not to name them now. People in power who could do a lot of damage to the world. So one sometimes wonders, why would God tolerate them, create them? I don't think we can be all that really clear about any of this. My own impression is, this, by the way, is one very fundamental difference. There are many differences, many things common between the overall Indian tradition and overall Abrahamic tradition. For example, in Christianity, there is a very strong belief that at the end of the days, all evil will be completely destroyed. In India, nobody ever believes this. Because their evil and good are both required for the manifested universe. So there is actually a very classical analogy that is used in India, that a dog has a curved tail. You can put this in a cylinder for 12 years, and the moment you take it out, it's curved again. So it can be that temporarily, at some places, for a little while, there can be some freedom from negative or evil, but overall the manifested universe requires both positive and negative. That's a very Indian attitude, very strong. Which is why maybe I should take a moment here to make this remark. Generally, in the Western tradition, when one speaks about transformation of consciousness, the notion seems to be to go from bad thoughts to good thoughts. That is the contents of consciousness that need to be changed. In India, for example, in the Yoga Sutras or in the Bhagavad Gita, one can see, it's not just the contents of consciousness, but the whole structure of consciousness that needs to be changed. It's closer to a species change, therefore going beyond good and evil. Not just going from evil to good. It's a very different kind of background. For example, I just give you this example. When Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna, that's his disciple to whom he is teaching, has been fairly transformed and is able to see the greater form of Krishna. So Krishna there says, among many things, I am the splendor of the splendid, wisdom of the wise, but also the cunning of the cheats. That is also required in the world. This will be very difficult to find something like this in the Abrahamic tradition. So one needs to understand there are differences, but that doesn't necessarily mean that one is right, the other is wrong. But to actually begin to, even to realize that the great sage, I always try to remind my friends, it is rather silly to imagine that half the sages of the world got the matter wrong. That is not a very generous way of looking at it anyway. But therefore to try to understand that they are trying to express something very subtle And we get so attached to the expression of truth as if that is the truth. So, need to go beyond this. So, for example, in the Western world, as you know, Nietzsche was very struck by Indian teachings, and he wrote a book called Beyond Good and Evil, and he was in a lot of trouble because of that. Because in the Western world, generally, that is regarded as either kind of wishy-washy or something completely impractical. So if Krishna says, I'm also the cunning of the cheats, do remember that devil was also created by God. Okay.
That seems like a perfect point. So, deep gratitude to you, Ravi, for your wisdom and for sharing it with us tonight. Thank you, all of you, for coming. There's probably a chance for a little more informal conversation with each other. And I hope you come to some future Palliative Care Institute events. So thank you so much.